Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Houston Oasis. My name's Alexis Potaman. I'll be your MC today. I normally like to start off the meeting with highlighting a couple of our core values that would normally be behind me, but they're not today, so don't look there. But today I want to highlight human hands solve human problems, and meaning comes from making a difference. We've got a great lineup for you today. We have some of our Oasis favorites as our musicians, Ken Gaines and Wayne Wilkerson, and our main talk will be by Brett Parker.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for letting me join you all this morning. Waited into recession. I didn't coach football. It was a difficult thing to get a high school history teaching job with those circumstances. So in that environment, I tacked on every certification I possibly could and ended up teaching English language learners at the elementary level. And when I got thrown into that environment, I had never thought about teaching elementary school before in my life. And the people I worked with were like magicians to me, that they could get 37-year-olds to do what they wanted. And I thought, I'm never going to be as good as they are at this, but maybe there's work I could do to help them to have an easier time with their jobs. So I got very involved with the Teachers Association, became vice president of our local bargained contracts. And really that led me to getting more involved politically because we liked our school board, we liked our administration, and we were just having to argue over what to cut rather than what to fund. So as I found a lot of people had this experience, I said, well, someone should do something about this, and started talking to people I thought should run for the legislature, and very quickly a lot of those conversations turned into people planning my own campaign. And eventually that sunk in, and I jumped in and ran for the state legislature. I served in the Kansas House for 5 years. This summer I moved out of my district, bought a home in Kansas City, Kansas, and stepped aside from that role. I also this past year started helped start an organization called Prairie Roots, which is a Kansas 501c4 voter engagement organization. The idea is there are a lot of folks who are either not registered to vote or who are registered but almost never turn out, and doing the really hard person-to-person work of trying to find these people, connect with them, find out what the barriers to voting are. Am I too quiet? That's not usually an issue for me. There we go. Can you all hear me? Sorry about that. Anyway, Prairie Roots was an organization to try and, or is an organization to try and engage people who don't turn out to vote in an attempt to try and shape the electorate, right? To get everyone involved and perhaps elect leaders who more accurately reflect the populations that they serve. And now I work with American Atheists as state policy manager. So in this role, I do a handful of things. I track legislation across all 50 states. We have this wonderful bill tracking program, so you can come up with searches for keywords or phrases or topics. I help write testimony for bills or give talking points to volunteers. But a big portion of my job is training volunteers, because I am one person. We try and track legislation across all 50 states and Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. So we are most effective when we are able to empower people on the ground. You know, I am a constituent in Kansas, but I'm not a constituent in Texas. And so my best work when it comes to policy in Texas is connecting with folks like you who say, hey, here's a bill we're really upset about. You know, have you all pulled together talking points or testimony on something similar? And because a lot of good and bad ideas are copied around the country in different state legislatures, then we get to be a resource for helping with that. And my general philosophy with political involvement in general, whether it's working with volunteers or lawmakers or anyone, is it's sort of just moving along or moving one rung up the ladder, right? So if you've never done anything political in your life, writing an email to your state legislator, or frankly just finding out who your state legislator is one step forward. If you're someone who's been very involved and you make emails and phone calls, but you've never been to the State House for a lobby day, that's a great step forward. If you're someone who's done those things, then maybe running for office is a step forward. But regardless, it's not our job to transform people from having done nothing to running for the U.S. Senate overnight. It's really meeting everyone where they are and trying to help them forward. And that's how I see my role with American Atheists. All right, so with that behind us, let's talk about our topic of the day, which is the landscape of reproductive rights across the country, the attacks on Roe versus Wade. And I made my PowerPoint before the Supreme Court hearing this past week, but I want to stop and kind of talk about that. I don't know how many of you had a chance to listen to the hearing or read up on it, but it's a stark situation. It appears very likely that when the court rules on either this Mississippi bill that they just did their hearing on, or perhaps Texas Senate Bill 8, it appears very likely that we're not going to have Roe versus Wade as we know it, either an official overruling or functionally overruling it. And what that's going to leave us with is state-by-state policy, which we have to some extent right now, but we've had that federal protection. So it will likely remain just as easy to access reproductive freedoms in Illinois or California or Colorado, but in states like Texas or like Kansas, where I'm from, that could become all but banned. As we're talking about this in Texas, we have a law here that essentially already accomplishes that. So I want to put that framing. That's not good news. It's not what I would love to be talking about, but that's the context we're working in. But it also frames the way that we do advocacy, because it means that the state legislative work is critically important in Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana and everywhere around, every state capital. So I want to look a little bit at what is the landscape of public opinion on this. So the vast majority of Americans will say that they do not want Roe versus Wade overturned. And there's a lot of different surveys on this, but it is close to a supermajority of Americans in pretty much every survey that you look at. The challenge of public opinion surveys on abortion is that you have, on one end, unrestricted access. On other end, you have total bans. And the biggest block of American opinion is that there should be access with some restrictions. But some restrictions is an incredibly vague place to be, right? And that allows those who really want to ban reproductive freedoms to be able to put all of their ideas forth almost within that realm. So, for example, the Texas bill. Well, it's not a complete ban, it's 6 weeks, right? Or it's not criminalizing the person who seeks care, it's just making everyone else financially liable. It is functionally a ban, but they're able to try to, for those who aren't paying close attention, pitch it as, well, we're just applying some restrictions to the otherwise, protected right here. I think it's also worth mentioning and highlighting that restrictions fall differently on different people. Like I said, we're probably headed towards a place where it's going to vary state by state. So if someone has the means to travel to a state where reproductive freedoms are more accessible and stay there, in many cases for multiple days, that is less of a burden for someone who that is financially impossible. And so what you're going to have is access that is very dependent on what are your just general access to healthcare resources, but also your financial resources to be able to potentially move or leave state to seek care. So there are a number of different kinds of restrictions or bans in state law. Everything from automatic trigger bans, which is states have passed in their legislatures a policy that says, should Roe v. Wade be overturned, abortion is banned in our state automatically. We don't have to take any further action. It's just that law is passed and it is just waiting for the trigger of overturning. That gets a little bit tricky once we see what the court does, because they may try to avoid officially overturning Roe. But chances are that a state that has passed one of those policies won't waste much time, even if it's not officially triggered, to just turn around and pass the most restrictive ban that they possibly could. There are also laws that are on the books from before Roe, that some are not enforced, some even in somewhat more progressive places like I know Michigan has some unenforced, pretty severe reproductive restrictions. That in a post-Roe landscape, the next governor of Michigan or the legislature could choose to tighten up or to begin enforcing. There are partial bans, right? We look at, different weeks into pregnancy. To this point, Roe, after the Casey decision in the early 90s, has said that there is a right to an abortion up to 22 weeks. Likely we will see that line of demarcation changed in some way, no matter what in a ruling, so you might see bans that push that further out. And then there are a lot of laws that just overly burden abortion providers in particular, right? They say that you have to have admitting privileges to a hospital, which shouldn't be necessary, or they put ridiculous standards that don't apply to any other outpatient surgery, or even restrictions on the width of the hallways, and all of these are just designed to burden providers to the point where they can no longer function. This is a great map from the Guttmacher Institute that looks at states likely to end up with some sort of ban should Roe be overturned officially or unofficially. And if you look at that, that's quite a few states. You don't have to do too in-depth of political analysis when you think of, the party that may control the legislatures and the governorship of most of those states. I'll point out my state, Kansas, is not one of them that's highlighted on there. Nonetheless, it probably would move pretty quickly just because of the political landscape there. There's not a trigger ban. In fact, our state Supreme Court ruled a year and a half ago that the state constitution protects a right to bodily autonomy, but sure enough, immediately after that, the legislature has proposed a constitutional amendment that would say only the legislature gets to set policy when it comes to reproductive freedoms, and that's on the ballot next August. So Kansas would be one more that would potentially be added to that. Oh, there we go. So we have, sorry, I didn't realize I made that point by point here. Texas SB 8 is one more complication in the landscape here, in that it's not necessarily an official overturning of Roe, potentially like the Mississippi law that was just heard, but functions as a ban, right? It's a backdoor way to try and create a ban on abortions in Texas. And what we've seen is that if that indeed is ultimately upheld for the long term, regardless of what happens in any other case, you'll see copycat bills like this. So already we're tracking a bill in Florida and one in Ohio. Pre-filing has begun for most state legislatures. We will see more. So this is the part that I really enjoy spending my time on. It's just less of the downer of the landscape, but what can we do about it, right? What is legislative or what state legislative advocacy, and why does it matter? No matter what, moving forward, most of these policies are going to be set at the state level. Those are the laws that are being brought before the Supreme Court to try and challenge Roe, and in a post-Roe landscape, we're not talking about banning reproductive services nationwide. They're talking about kicking it back to each individual state. So especially in places like Texas, or where I'm from, Kansas, that means our work is really cut out for us. But change is possible. I was just chatting with Will last night, and we were talking about chipping away at these freedoms didn't happen overnight, right? It happened because the advocates on the other side have worked and worked and worked and moved things forward incrementally. Things do not just magically continue on in the direction that they have started, right? Just because the landscape of reproductive freedom has gotten worse in recent years does not mean that that is the long-term forever trend. In fact, it's up to us as citizens in every state in the country to engage and make our voices heard and get involved with that. It is possible also to avert more negative legislation. This is a challenge perhaps in Texas because right now the Texas bill, SB 8, that is left in effect is one of the most severe in the country. So if I were speaking elsewhere, we would be talking about avoiding something like that coming up. But if the Mississippi case, if Mississippi prevails in the Supreme Court case that was just heard this week, there could be other negative legislation proposed in Texas soon. And it is possible for us to stand in that gap, to work with other partners, and to push back on that. And lastly, it's important that lawmakers know you exist. I will say this as someone who served in the Kansas House. I represented 23,000 people, a little 8-square-mile section of suburban Kansas. It wasn't, it's not the most esteemed thing or grand thing. You're just the person going to the grocery store along with everyone else. But it's really important to hear from people. You normally only hear from sometimes the angriest people or the ones who have the most extreme views. It's really important just to hear from everyone and to have that connection. And especially as a community of, people who don't identify by their faith, it's important for lawmakers to know that we exist too, and to keep that in mind when they're making policies, a lot of times on the basis of religious dogma. So if there's a silver lining to where we're at right now, it's this. I think there is an advocacy opportunity. Change happens in a variety of ways, but one of the ways change happens in a big way politically is when there is overreach and there's a backlash. Well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the political history of Kansas. It's a fairly conservative state. But in 2016, while a lot of things were going more conservative in the country, Kansas had a wave in their primary Republican primary elections where centrist Republicans defeated incumbent conservatives. And then we had a wave of Democratic representatives winning elections in November, and I was part of that wave. The reason that happened is because a man named Sam Brownback ran for governor of Kansas in 2010 and wanted to be the champion of all of the theoretical conservative ideas that the think tanks had kicked out so that he could run for president someday. And he swept into the governor's mansion by a big margin, and the next legislative elections, he helped to purge a lot of the remaining moderate Republicans who were going to stand in the way of his agenda. He was wildly successful, passed this sweeping tax reform plan that promptly left the state pretty much bankrupt and brought us to the Supreme Court for not funding schools. And there was such a backlash that even in 2016, in the Republican primaries, candidates who wanted to raise taxes, a few of them who were even pro-choice, knocked off incumbents. And then in November of 2016, when things were not going particularly well for the Democratic Party as a whole, Kansas House Democrats netted 12 new seats. All of that because overreach, right? It's not that Kansas as a whole decided it was suddenly going to be a very Democratic state, or that they loved taxes all the time. But the implementation of those ideas sparked the regular people who may not have always made their voices heard in the state house to get involved and to fight back. I joked with people when I was knocking doors in 2016 that really our goal was that Kansas wouldn't be a punchline on late night TV anymore, right? You don't have to be a budget expert to know when your state has gone so far off the deep end that everyone else is watching and wondering, what's wrong there. And that is an opportunity here as well. Like we said before, most Americans' opinion around reproductive freedoms is that there should be some level of abortion access with restrictions. That sounds nice in theory, and it's easy for people who aren't paying that close of attention to think, oh, it's not that big of a deal, these are just some restrictions, I'm within that camp. It makes a difference when you start to see what those effects are, right? And that this doesn't work as nicely as the talking points as the people who had passed it said. In fact, one of the things we've already seen in Texas with SB 8 is people who want to be pregnant, who are trying to have a child and have complications, are suddenly not able to access life-saving care because of SB 8. And we've seen this in other instances around the country. As a side note, that can happen in very progressive places if you go to a hospital whose policies don't allow them to provide, all of the best medical care. Even in California, we've seen that. But those stories matter, right? And those stories add context to why we are opposed to these things in the first place, because they affect real lives. And our advocacy opportunity, though we wish we didn't have to do it, is that as these laws may go into effect in more and more places, is to be a part of elevating those voices and the people who are most affected by it. And if that's you and you're able to tell your story, wonderful. But if that's not you and you're able to support people who are telling those stories, or to help lift up those stories at the State House, or even just in your own community, that matters. Political change happens, yes, from talking with legislators, and that's mostly, what I'm helping people with. But it also matters just from people talking with their community and engaging their community. Our, backlash in Kansas wasn't everyone suddenly lobbying their state legislators, though there was a lot of that. It was also just talking to their neighbors and going, wow, can you believe how bad this has gotten? And did you see this article that, highlighted the effects of this? And in Kansas, it got real once the schools were being touched. I think in a lot of cases in a lot of states around the country, this is going to unfortunately become more real to a lot of people, either personally or people in their lives. And it is our job to help tell those stories, support those stories, and know how to effectively push back. So this is the part that I spend most of my time on, which is, how do you advocate? This can look like a lot of different things, but number one is reaching out to your lawmakers and letting them know that you exist. So I know, the Texas legislature is not in session finally this year after, rounds and rounds of special sessions. And you all are a bit unique in that it doesn't meet every single year, so next year there's not a regularly scheduled legislative session. That's actually a great opportunity to connect with lawmakers, though, right? It means that they're not in Austin. They're probably doing their day job back in Houston right now. So if you haven't already connected with a legislator, send an email, make a phone call. I'm not entirely sure how it works in Texas, but in Kansas, I will say phone calls were a very underrated way of getting a hold of state lawmakers. We got lots of emails, and they were great, and that's a wonderful way to get in touch with people. If I got more than one phone call a day, it was a busy day by phone. I probably averaged 2 a week from constituents. And I know that's a little bit of a different thing to think about, because when we do advocacy at the federal level, a lot of times it's call your congressional office, call the Senate office. They take down your opinion, and you're kind of added to a tally mark probably for either way, because you talk with a staffer. That just was an underutilized way, so I would suggest that as well if you're comfortable with it. And a lot of times you're going to talk with an office assistant who is just a lovely human being who has, who's not fighting back on your policy position, but will just hear you and, make a note of your call, and perhaps you can request a call back. It's important that lawmakers know what you think, just in general, right, on any issue. But I would always advocate, do it in a way that builds a relationship, even if it's with someone that you don't agree with. I try to talk with folks who want to do legislative advocacy and put it in terms of, think of the people who are paid way too much to do this full time, right? There is a whole career path of lobbyists who this is their work, and they are well compensated for it because they're particularly good at it. They don't yell and scream. They don't really try and strong-arm legislators. What they do is they try to be a resource. They say, here I am, and I have this great information that will help you as you, weigh your next vote. Here I am. They also, if you fundamentally disagree with them on one issue, it's within their job's interest not to burn that bridge over it, right? So you've made your case, they disagree with you, try and leave it on terms that will allow you to come back the next time and the time after that and the time after that. There were people I disagreed with a lot, but still knew that they knew their stuff, and that they were going to show up professionally and try and make their case. And I, as a lawmaker, gave a lot more credence to those views than someone who would just send me an angry email and then never want to talk to me again because I disagreed on one issue. So you can begin building those relationships. It sounds like a scary thing, but again, lawmakers are, I was going to say regular people. It takes a special kind of weird to maybe want to do that. But aside from that, it's pretty regular. Just as an aside, when I ran, I've always been a big nerd, I guess, and even among my friend group. And I had sort of this idea when I ran for the state house in Kansas that, won't it be great? There's 125 state representatives in Kansas, so if I win, I will get to go and hang out with the 124 other biggest policy nerds in the state of Kansas. It was a very naive mindset, and needless to say, that was not my experience once I got there. I served with lovely people, but a lot of times they were just members of their community. Someone said, hey, you should do this, people like you. So there's nothing magical about it. It's just a conversation with another person about your beliefs. So some of the ways that you can do this, beyond just reaching out off session, which is important, and that's what I'd highlight. If you are someone who yes, I've already done that, they know who I am, testifying at hearings is a possibility. Now again, I know you don't have a legislative session scheduled for next year, but we'll watch for special sessions. But thinking long term, if you want to make your voice heard and there's a bill that you care about, positive or negative, sign up to testify. Reach out to the committee that's holding the hearing. Be professional, submit, your nice written up testimony, and then in some cases be prepared to answer some questions and talk about things. But it's also, should you do this, entirely okay to not have all the answers. Your job is to tell your story or your perspective. In fact, whether it's testifying at a hearing or campaigning for someone, I always tell folks, it's actually, every time you don't have an answer to something, it's an opportunity. Because you now have been given an invitation to follow back up with people and demonstrate that you are someone who will follow through, who cares enough about it to make more than the single effort, and also to continue to be a resource, right? So if you care about a bill and you offer your perspective and a kind of obnoxious legislator wants to grandstand and ask a really difficult question back, it's okay to say, I don't know, but I'm going to follow up with you, right? And then you can come back to, frankly, folks who do my job or other organizations and ask the detailed policy questions, and we can work with you to come back on that. Lobby days are also a great way to get involved. If you have not been to the State House or you have not been to the State House to talk with lawmakers, there's sometimes strength in numbers. So whether that would be through an organization like American Atheists, if we should put something together, or if there is a Planned Parenthood group that does a lobby day, or whomever, and regardless of the issue, is a great way to get involved for the first time, because you'll probably be coached that day on, here's how you do your meeting with a lawmaker, here's the nice handout with the bullet points of the bill we're talking about, here's how you tell your story related to this. But you also don't have to do it by yourself. Usually you'll send people in groups of 2 or 3. I always liked these days as a legislator because you just got to meet some real people and hear from them instead of professional lobbyists. It's also wonderful if you look at the pictures there. It helps if everyone's wearing the same color, so you're just super visible in the Capitol, and that everyone's going, oh, who's this giant group who's here today? I wonder what they have to say. I know this is not always the most accessible thing, right, if you don't live in the state city or in the state capitol, or many of us have jobs that keep us busy during the day, which is when most of these hearings happen. But if you have the opportunity, it's a great chance. And I should say, even on testifying, if you don't have the ability to drive to Austin and testify, a lot of times you can still submit written testimony, and then that's also an opportunity to follow up via email or phone call with legislators and say, hey, did you get that? Do you have any questions? And build that relationship that way. If you are curious about following work or learning more about what's going on in your state and the State House, I would offer, there are lots of organizations that do this, but American Atheists has a state legislative tracker on our website. We track legislation on a variety of topics. The guiding philosophy tends to be supporting separation of church and state, but then outside of that, opposing using religion to legislate harm to other people. And that is why reproductive freedoms are one of the things that we work on. It's why LGBTQ rights are one of the things that we work on, because so much of the work in chipping away at these things happens under the guise of a dominant religious dogma, right? I've been in the State House arguing the other side of this, but a lot of times the people pushing it are quoting the Bible. They're using their religion and saying this is what should apply to all. And I've served with people who that is their deeply held belief. They don't care about the Constitution. They don't care about plurality. They don't care about any of us in this room. They think it is their job, and they were put here on this earth to legislate, what it says in their Bible, or what they think it says in their Bible to everyone else. So this exists on our website. Our website is just atheist.org. There's different tabs on there, but the advocacy tab, I believe, is the one where you find this. Just for what it's worth, Texas is bright red on here, not necessarily because all of the bills are bad, but it shades based on the number of bills we're tracking, and since Texas had, I think, 4 legislative sessions this year, we ended up with a whole bunch of bills in Texas, in part because bills got refiled each new session with a new number on them. That said, most of them weren't great. So if you go to this and you click on Texas, it will show you the bills that we're tracking, and it will show from our perspective, which is mostly me and my boss, are we in support or opposition of the bill. It's also super helpful for me if you know something that's happening that's not on our tracker, feel free to reach out because we would like to be adding that. A lot of things we track very in depth, like again, separation of church and state issues. We're one of the lead organizations on that. But when it comes to reproductive freedoms, there are other organizations that do a lot of that work and take the lead there. So a lot of times we count on referrals from them or from people we know in the States. But this is just a nice tool if you want to easily follow some of the bills that are going on, dig in, you can click on them, read the briefs of them, and that sort of thing. I also want to take just a minute to talk about helping those in need right now, right? Setting aside policy change and the long term, there are resources available for people who need help accessing care. And this is just a quick rundown of all the different abortion funds in Texas. Abortionfunds.org is the source, so you don't have to, try and see the small print up there. But abortionfunds.org for any state connects people with the abortion funds. And this can help with covering cost of care, but also potentially cost of travel and accommodations where needed. And then there are other resources as well. Planned Parenthood is obviously a very powerful one. Needabortion.org is another one, and I believe this is Texas focused, but helping connect people with funds, but also where are the closest places where they can access care, walking them through the barriers there. And then also, lastly, make sure I get that right, National Abortion Federation has a hotline that can help people, again, connect with funds, but also walk through where to find care as well. And I want to leave it there because this is a big topic. I'm probably running short on time here too. But also, really want to make sure that we have time if there are questions and answers around the state of things, but also how to make your voice heard about it.
Hi, enjoyed your talk, and I've always been interested in how would be the most effective way to communicate with these legislators and stuff. And I remember my son once, as a Boy Scout project, sent a letter to one of these guys, and they responded, but on a totally different topic, like it was a forum type deal, that didn't make any difference. But I saw that you had email and phone calls. Phone calls is an interesting one I hadn't thought about. And you didn't even mention a letter. So those are not accepted or really?
No, that's a great flag. Honestly, that's a great way to do it because you don't get a ton of them.
Oh, okay.
was going to say the challenge with that is if you do a handwritten letter or typed letter, I would give them a way to contact you back. That's email or phone, just because this is not an excuse, though it'll feel this way a lot of times when you're trying to catch lawmakers. But the day is crazy and it's unpredictable. So them writing you back might be more challenging, but if you put an email address or a phone number and ask that they respond in that way, that could be a really effective thing. As a general rule, and it always pains me because I can't remember who said this, but I think my first year running or in the legislature, another lawmaker had said, as a general rule, basically, the amount of effort that it takes you to do your advocacy is pretty well correlated to the impact it will have, right? So if you get a email petition that you sign your name onto, and there's nothing wrong with those, we will send some of them out too. It's easy for you. It won't have the biggest impact for the lawmaker. A handwritten letter, though, obviously you get that and you know that someone has really taken their time with that. And then while we're on that too, I would just say as a tangent, if you have the opportunity to email a lawmaker, you don't have to write your life story, but something unique and personal goes a whole lot further than the same text that they got 50 other times. It matters, right? When I got those that, had the same text, I paid attention to how many I was getting, but I didn't read every word every single time because it was, 2 pages of the exact same text. Whereas if one of those people had just written me one paragraph just with their own little story, that would have helped highlight the then 50 more that I got that were advocating for the same thing. But I'm really glad that you brought that up because that is also an underused way. The one thing, I'd just make sure there's an easy way for them to get back to you that is not them mailing something back. One more.
Yeah, whenever I hear about the abortion issue, I always think of birth control as I'm not hearing enough about making birth control pills and devices and free to everybody and available to everybody, free vasectomies for men, anything that we can do. I mean, there would be very few abortions on that end to do. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about.
No, I think that's a great point as well. And if you bring that up with lawmakers, it's going to vary person to person. Frustratingly, there are many lawmakers pushing, bills like SB 8 in Texas or equivalents elsewhere, who also have no interest in increasing access to birth control, right? So my last session in Kansas legislature, I was the ranking member on the health committee, and one of the things that I thought I could find common ground with the Republican chairwoman was, can we talk about, making access to birth control, increasing access to birth control? And her response was, well, because of my religion, I don't believe in that. I'd served with her for 5 years and I was still kind of shocked by that response. That said, I was chatting with someone as we were standing here. All these things, we make the difference not by 100% conversion of, the people we're advocating for. You make the difference on the margins, and you don't know, what's going to be the tipping point to make the argument. Sorry, it was Stephen. I see your name tag there now. We were talking about making the difference on the margins, but you don't know, right? You don't have to convince everyone. A lot of these votes are close, even in places with near supermajorities or supermajorities. Some of them are not close, but I do think that's a really good point to bring up when advocating with lawmakers. But it's also a better point just with community and with everyone, because I think the number of lawmakers who are philosophically opposed to birth control is the proportion of them far outstrips the proportion of the general public who would have an issue with that, because it makes so much sense. And I would encourage you too, if you have an interest in that as a policy topic, the state of Colorado did a program, probably about a decade ago now, where they made long-acting reversible contraception freely available. And what they saw was that basically every social indicator you would think would be affected was positively affected, right? You had the number of abortions went down, but also the level of social services needing to be accessed. Like all of the teen pregnancy went way down. That was, I think, maybe the most compelling figure in there. And their program, I think they had some private funding for it, and then I believe an administration changed and they kind of let it lapse. But that is the best data on why what you're talking about works, is that it's been put to the test. If you make it more available, it's more effective.
Another thing about that is that a lot of conservatives believe that certain forms of birth control are abortion.
So, and to that point too, this is where actual face-to-face conversations can, if there is ever a chance to change the mind of someone who is sort of that far out there with their beliefs, it's likely not going to be an email, it's likely not going to be a phone call. But if you are an advocate or can be a part of a lobby day or something like that where you can get trained in that, the only way you can begin to pull someone back from being that far out there is probably face-to-face and talking through and letting them, ask their probably, not the most informed questions is probably the nicest way to put that, right? But having a real conversation where you can kind of walk someone through to, okay, what you were told is not true. Here's, medically how this works. But I mean, that's spot on. There are a lot of lawmakers who their belief is that extreme. The nice thing is, even in, a state like Texas or Kansas where you have those, does Texas have a supermajority, or is it just close to it? Okay, so, about a two to one split. The majority party is not wholly made up of representatives or senators who think that, types of birth control are actually abortions, right? There's way too many of them, don't get me wrong. And it's great, again, trying to move everyone one step up the ladder. In that case, your goal is literally just to help give them real information that might dislodge them from that most extreme of beliefs. But winning a vote is going to be with the most reasonable, half of the majority party and saying, okay, wouldn't it make sense to increase access to these things?
Hi, how gerrymandered is Kansas? And if that's a part of the political landscape there, what are strategies for dealing with it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So voting rights was kind of my main issue when I was a legislator, and so this is near and dear to my heart, but it really undergirds everything else that we talk about. Kansas is not particularly gerrymandered because the last redistricting process, House and Senate Republicans couldn't agree with each other, so they just failed to pass new maps, and we got maps for the last decade that were put out by our legislative research, but really put out by the federal court that had to intervene. But in general, gerrymandering and sort of just drawing more and more polarized districts makes all of these things more difficult because it means that the median voter that someone has to appeal to is not the median of the community, it's the median of their party primary. And that's a vastly different thing, right? Even if you go to, like say in Kansas, some of the most conservative districts are rural Kansas. If you went and found the median voter there, they are more moderate than the representative who is representing them, because that representative knows that all they have to do is get the median primary voter, and so that's who they're always pandering to. And that happens in those most extreme cases, but it affects, unless a district is truly competitive in the general election, the incentive is to pander to their own party primary. And the folks in those districts get to stay the longest too if they successfully do it, because they're never going to lose a general election, which means they get seniority in their party, they chair committees, they may be able to run for leadership positions more than you might have a more moderate member of their party who has to run in a competitive general election every time. Well, they're going to lose sometimes, right? It's a competitive race. Some years it's going to be good, some years it's going to be bad. So you end up with a system that reinforces keeping around the people with the most extreme beliefs and turning over pretty frequently the ones who are more middle of the road.
Well, first, thank you for encouraging us atheists to be politically active. It's a powerful way of normalizing us in a Christian culture. And you don't even have to have a college degree to run for school board in your child's district. So that's one way to start.
I want to tack on one thing there too that you prompted me, I forgot to mention. There's value in meeting with people who will just be thrilled that you're there, right? That you don't have to convince of a single thing, just being present. I never had an atheist group come and meet with me as a lawmaker in Kansas. It would have been a great day if I did. And I think we're seeing this especially at the local level with the school board comment prompted this. People who are good school board members are having a miserable time right now. I mean, just they're literally getting death threats in some cases, but they're being harassed constantly. Every time they show up for a board meeting, it is the craziest of the crazy coming up and shouting at them. Just advocacy for people who already agree with you, just to thank them for what they're doing, and to be present and let them know that you exist. You have no idea how far that may go, because none of these jobs pay particularly well, right? They're all sort of an act of service to the community, and just being supportive of the people who are doing a solid job will help keep them around longer, so you don't have to continue to fight to find the new person just to maintain the status quo.
Yeah, here. But let me first qualify as a gay man. I don't have a dog in this hunt, but I have an opinion. And I'm not sure how to phrase this question, but why is there no effort afoot to identify and make the fathers also equally responsible for when an abortion is asked for or needed or wanted?
That's a great question.
Do you know of any? It sounds like Colorado may have come close.
So Colorado's efforts were around making contraception more available. I don't know that they did anything around accountability for men in those cases. You know, I don't have a great answer for you other than women are vastly underrepresented in state government, well, and most elected offices. And for what it's worth, I would say there's no reason for that. I know it's frustrating at the presidential level, but virtually every other level of running for office, when women run, they have just as good, if not better, outcomes of winning. And also, while we're here, one of the pieces that makes that more difficult is usually women have to be asked to run for office more often than men. So if you're a woman here, count this as one of the, I think 8 is the average amount of times. Run for office. We need you, right? For any number of policy areas. But when you have domination of decision making by, you know, smaller groups of people or just overrepresented, you end up with laws that don't make as much sense. And I think it's a great point, but it is, I've not seen that get much traction virtually anywhere.
I want to actually answer a little bit of CB's question. Men, of course, are very important and should be held responsible. As someone who helps with abortion access, plenty of women who need abortions also need to not be in a relationship with the man who's gotten them pregnant. So for some women, having an abortion is a way to cut that tie. Otherwise, they're going to be tied to this person, depending on the state that you live in, forever. And you know, especially if they're in an abusive relationship, they don't want to do that. So that's just another kind of perspective. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the filibuster and also any kind of Supreme Court reform. You know, I know they're kind of pie in the sky dreams, but.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for adding that context before. That's incredibly helpful. I'll speak to this, I guess, maybe within the context of our topic of the day. One of the questions that was asked to me standing up here was, could we just pass a constitutional amendment that enshrines Roe? And challenge with that would be, one, you'd have to get 2/3 majorities in both chambers, but then it'd have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, and both of those things are, unlikely to happen anytime soon. It is possible, theoretically, to pass the Women's Health Protection Act, which has passed the House now and sits in the Senate, which would essentially codify Roe v. Wade, not in the Constitution, but in statute. It could be, undone by future legislatures, but at least for the time being, you could do that. The challenge is that you don't need 50 plus 1 votes in the Senate, you need 60, right? And that is unlikely to happen. So I think as as people talk about whether or not we should keep the filibuster, that is one of many issues that goes into that, where you could reflect the majority opinion of America in law in this instance, but you can't, because not only do you need 60 votes, but the Senate being what it is, it overrepresents smaller rural states and vastly underrepresents more populous states. So just the way that things fall politically in America, you have an overrepresentation of opponents to reproductive freedoms and an underrepresentation of proponents of it. So I don't see a solution to getting that into law short of having a simple majority and doing away with the filibuster. I think that's just the reality that we're in right now.
I'm going to do a question, and then you'll be the last question. How worthwhile is it to reach out to a representative that's not your direct rep? A lot of times they say they can only take constituencies, but they're also kind of probably convince the most.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess always start or always make sure you're reaching out to your own reps. But especially if you have a unique story to tell, right? If one of these things has affected you personally, or you feel like there's, otherwise a reason for you to connect with other lawmakers, by all means, it doesn't hurt, right? Like, attempting to reach out probably won't burn any bridges. They might politely say, you know what, I'm hearing from a lot of people, but I'm going to prioritize my constituents. That's fine. But there are also instances where everyone should be reaching out. And we do this with our action alerts for American Atheists. If there's a bill in committee, your representative might not be on that committee, but you still should have a voice on what happens with that bill, So, for example, on the topics we're talking about, a lot of health committees will be dealing with this. If your legislators aren't on the health committee, you should still be able to reach out to members of the health committee and say, hey, I am a Texan. This bill matters to me for these reasons. I urge you to, vote this way or amend it in such a way. So I think it's fine, but I would try and, prioritize those times where it makes the most sense. So again, if it's in a committee that's hearing something, or if you just have a unique perspective that maybe they're not hearing enough and that needs to be told beyond just your rep, that's great too.
Yeah. All right, last question.
Hey, y'all. I hear what you're saying about sometimes the men should not be in the picture. And I love your point that more women should be running for office. But it somehow seems like we're putting the burden on the women. The women have to change the laws. The women have to deal with it alone. This is not just a woman's problem, and we need to get men to see that this is a problem of both men and women. And it looks like most of us here are, forgive me, but slightly older, and we don't have to worry about getting pregnant or getting anybody pregnant. But what happens if your 15-year-old son or grandson gets some 14-year-old knocked up and there's no access to abortion? Who do you think is going to be taking care of those two young people for the next 20 years, even if there isn't a law that says that men should be part of this bringing up an unwanted child? We have to get more men involved and seeing it as not just a woman's problem and something for them to worry about and something for them to change. It's all of us. And if anybody has any suggestions on how to do that, I would love to hear that. Thanks.
It's a great point. Thank you. I don't know that I can say that any better than you just did, but I agree. You know, it takes everyone. And just, I guess, reinforcing, we started on, these things don't happen overnight. They happen because people get involved and we advocate, and, you know, not everything is within our control, and we're working at the margins, but you do that long enough and consistently enough, and you start to see change. But the more who are involved, the better that goes, and that includes all of us. Thank you. Thank you all. I really appreciate getting to join you all. This was wonderful.
Highway, but nothing else but time between the last stop and the next one down the line. It's a simpler way of living, a simpler way to see, leaving all my worldly cares behind. Way out here, I can see it all so clearly. Way out here, where the mountains meet the sky, how everyone I love and I hold dear come together in the distance way out here. Together in the distance way out here. Somewhere behind me is the man I used to be, lost before I knew him as a friend. Somewhere out in front I know he's waiting there for me as I sweep across the circle once again. Way out here I can see it all so clearly. Way out here where the mountains meet the sky, how everyone I love, all that I hold dear, come together in the distance way out here. Together in the distance way out here. To bear, I lift my eyes and sing this little prayer. You can sing it too. Way out here I can see it all so clearly. Way out here where the mountains meet the sky, how everyone I love, all that I hold come together in the distance way out here. Together in the distance way out here. Thank you very much.